The 12 Principles of Animation. Now, you may be very familiar with these 12 basic principles. You may have never heard of these things before, or maybe you're somewhere in between where you've heard some of the terms, may even know what some of the terms are, but aren't exactly sure what all of them are. These principles have been developed basically from the Disney animators, the nine old men creating Disney films. They kind of came up with them, as they went along to really set the bar for their animation. And they were the 12 basic things that they felt were imperative to quality storytelling and animation and what they were trying to achieve in their films. So what I want to do is I'm just going to go over these really briefly now, all 12, and then we're going to jump into Maya and kind of go into these principles a little bit more in depth. Uh, so you really can understand them and know how to apply them to your own work when you're animating. Now, these 12 basic principles are not only used in film, but they're used in any kind of animation. They can be used obviously in game animation. We all use them. Film animation, TV animation, web animation. It's really anything, even for website animation, for animating buttons and things like that. The really best of the best use these principles in some form or another to create the best looking animation and get the best results from what they're animating. All right, so let's take it from the top here. These 12 are in no particular order. We're going to start off with timing and spacing. All right, timing refers to the number of frames for a given action, which basically translates to the speed of that action. The slower the action, the more frames are going to be used. The faster the action, the fewer frames an object's going to have when you're animating. Correct timing makes objects appear to abide by the laws of physics, and that will give the audience the belief that the object is real within the world that it exists. Now, when you use timing correctly, your characters will have proper weight to them and be more convincing to the audience. And that's key. And when I say audience, you'll hear me say that a lot. That can mean, the film audience, the person that's playing the video game. They're all the audience, people that are watching and participating in what it is that you've done as an animator. All right, number 2 is anticipation. Basically, anticipation is used to prepare the audience for an action and to make an action appear more realistic and to keep the audience from missing an upcoming action that may be extremely fast. So think about, before you jump, you squat down. That's the anticipation of squatting before jumping up in the air. Or when you throw a ball, there's that wind up and then the throw. Now, if you're animating either one of those two things and you don't have that anticipation and the character just pops up or suddenly throws a ball from, standing position, the audience might be confused for such a quick action to happen and they're not prepared for it. So anticipation is used a lot to preparing the audience for, an upcoming action. And it's also gives that animation, a sense of realism. Now, in games, a lot of times we can't use anticipation as much as we'd like. And the reason being is that, first and foremost, gameplay is at the top of the list of importance, and everything is subservient to that. So, when a player's, playing a game, whether it's a console game or a, PC game, and they hit a button and they expect an action for that character to, like a jump or something, the character has to jump quickly immediately when they hit the button, so there's no time for that, big anticipation. Now, where we can use anticipation is things like big finishing moves. Think of God of War here, where suddenly there's this big slowdown of, this big wind up for a big punch, in the air, then quickly speeds up and then does the hit. That's where you can really use anticipation to our advantage and use it the most in the video games when we're animating. All right, 3, straight ahead, pose to pose. This is basically referring to a method of animating. Straight ahead's basically meaning, you start off with a pose and you just animate straight ahead until your animation's done, until that move that you're animating is completed. Pose to pose is basically more thought out, more pre-planned, where you're breaking a motion down to its key poses. You animate those poses, you set those poses in the computer, and then you continue to break those poses down more and more until the animation is done. In traditional animation, it was said that straight ahead animation happened to have more life to it and was more vivacious, where pose to pose could be a little bit more, a little dull, not quite as energetic. And computer animators, again, whether it's film or games, we typically will use like a combination of two of these. Pose to pose works really well in the computer, and I think that's the way most animators work. But again, sometimes things are done straight ahead. Especially if you have an idea and you want to test it out, you basically will just animate it straight ahead. Pose to pose is nice because it lends itself to having a lot of flexibility throughout the process of the animation, meaning you can make changes pretty late in the game and really not lose too much work, whereas straight ahead may not always be the case. So that's why I tend to use pose to pose probably 90% of the time. All right, number 4, arcs. Natural and organic movement tends to follow an arced trajectory. Mechanical movement tends to move linearly, so it's best avoided. Of course, unless of course you're animating like machinery or possibly a robot. So think of an arm swing here on a walk. The path that the arm's going to follow as it swings from the two extremes, meaning back and then behind the body and then forward in front of the body, is not just a perfectly straight line. It arcs down. And again, we'll be getting through this, get into this a little more detail once we get into Maya. Number 5, follow through and overlapping action. Follow through is the idea that when a character stops, other parts of the body will keep moving or follow through and then come to a stop shortly afterwards. Again, think of a walk. You come to a stop. Your whole body's not going to stop immediately at the same time. Your body stops, then your arms will swing forward and then, settle afterwards. Overlapping action is the idea that different parts of the body have different timings. For example, their timings will overlap. So again, going back to, the walk example, it might take 10 frames for the torso to come to a complete stop, but then the arms settle, 15 frames later, or not 15 frames later, but, several frames later. So they're not all stopping at the exact timing. These actions are overlapping one another. Think of a fat character jumping, and the character jump, the stomach is going to continue to bounce before it stops, even after the jump is ended. All right, so let's go to number 6, staging. Basically, staging is the same principle that's used in theater and film. It's used to direct the audience's attention to what's most important in a scene, to make it clear and avoid any unnecessary detail. As animators, we don't have a lot of control over this. When I was on DC, in the cases that we did have some control, was when the designers were working on an in-game cinematic. Basically, you walk into a room and then this little movie plays in-game. And we'd work with the designers. I know one of the animators would actually storyboard the scene out, because a lot of times designers aren't familiar with cinematics and photography and the best camera composition and things like that. Whereas an animator should have exposure to this stuff and really learn what makes good staging and design of a shot, so that way when it's presented to the players, it's much more engaging, and the action's not off screen, or you run the risk of losing your the players if that's the case. So it was really cool being able to work with the designers as they kind of built the stuff, and we kind of helped them in certain cases to design the scenes. All right, number 7, slow ins and outs, are also known as eases, ease in or ease out. Basically, it just means that an object will take time to get up to speed, and then it'll take time for it to slow down before a stop. The thing is, when you're going from one pose keyframe to the next keyframe, if it's going to slow out of that first keyframe, and then it'll ease into the next one, or slow in to that next one. I always got a little confused with the term. I would always mix it up because I always thought it was easing into the motion and then easing out of the motion, but it's easing into the keyframe or out of a keyframe. So again, we'll cover this a little more thoroughly later on. Number 8, secondary action. Basically, secondary action is any action that is used to support the main action. Again, going back to the walk or run, the secondary action would be, the swinging of the arms, or, if the character's walking where he's whistling, or, maybe, spinning a gun in his hand, or, doing the action of flipping the action of a butterfly knife or something like that. That would be a secondary action. Key thing is that secondary action should never distract from the main action. If it does, then you want to get rid of it. Exaggeration. Number 9. Normal realistic movement can tend to look dull and boring. We see this every day. We use exaggeration to push the movement to be more dynamic and have more entertainment value. It's always important, when you're using reference for an animation, to use it as just reference. It's a jumping off point, and you want to try to exaggerate whenever possible to get more entertainment and dynamism from your animation, because that's really what we're going for. And it's one of the reasons why I'm not a huge fan of motion capture games. Definitely has a value to it. I think it can be used in certain aspects, but there's other aspects where I think adding and exaggerating some of the poses, for example, it just really helped to push the animation to make it just much more entertaining, from the viewer's aspect. Let's see, 10, squash and stretch. Basically, when squash and stretch is used correctly, it can give a sense of weight and flexibility to a character. This is usually used extensively in cartoony games, and it's far more subtle in realistic type games. Obviously, you're going to notice it a lot in a cartoony game, because part of that squash and stretch adds to the comedic nature of the game. But it's also used in, realistic games. When a character is, there's certain aspects of a walk or a run where the body compresses. So you want to try to squash the body a little bit. And, on a jump or, the upward movement of a walk or run, the body's going to stretch out a little bit. You're not really going to notice that as much as you would notice it in a cartoon or a cartoony game. But, as animators, there are things we have to always keep in mind when we're animating, even in realistic type scenarios. 11, solid drawing. Again, this, applies more to traditional hand-drawn animation. It's really the character department's job to make the models look really good. The computer keeps the characters on model for us, so it's not something that we have a lot of control over. But what we do have control over is using good, strong poses that have really good, clear, readable silhouettes, and are very dynamic and appealing. And again, that leads us into appeal. And again, this is more oriented to a traditional animation. Basically, appeal is characters, whether they're good or evil, are appealing to an audience. They're designed and animated to be believable, not necessarily realistic, but believable. And again, as animators, good posing, strong timing, all of those things will really help add to the character's appeal. All right, so that's basically it, and the 12 basic principles in a nutshell. And we will jump over to Maya and cover some timing and spacing.